June 18, 1944, northern France. The morning fog did not drift across the countryside. It clung to it. A cold, wet mist lay heavy over the Norman Valley, pressing down on hedgerows, fields, and dirt roads like a damp blanket pulled tight over the land. Sound was muted. Distance felt distorted. Even the war seemed for a moment unreal, as if the world itself were holding its breath. At precisely 0542 hours, General Klaus von Richter stood inside a reinforced concrete observation post carved into a limestone ridge overlooking the valley floor. He had been awake since before dawn. Binoculars were pressed firmly against his eyes, their metal rims biting into weathered skin. His elbows rested on the concrete lip of the firing slit, a position so familiar he could have held it in his sleep. Below him lay the full strength of the 352nd Infantry Division, nearly 12,000 men, spread across what appeared to be a well-concealed, carefully organized staging area. From this height, the valley looked almost peaceful. Canvas tents were arranged in neat rows beneath tree lines still dripping with fog. Camouflage netting sagged under the weight of moisture, masking tanks, half-tracks, and self-propelled guns. Thin columns of smoke rose from field kitchens as soldiers brewed morning coffee. Their movements relaxed. Routine. Human. This was not an army expecting death. Von Richter had personally approved the position 2 weeks earlier. The valley was shielded from direct observation, protected by surrounding ridges, and distant from known Allied artillery concentrations. According to every doctrine he had learned and taught, it was secure. He had fought in 2 wars. In 1917, as a young lieutenant, he had watched men dissolve into mud under British barrages at Passchendaele. He had survived poison gas, collapsing trenches, and artillery fire so dense it turned daylight into a permanent dusk. Between wars, he had studied, written, lectured, refining the lessons of the last conflict so Germany would never again be caught unprepared. And yet, standing there in the misty silence of that June morning, something unsettled him. Not fear, not intuition, something colder. Behind him, the observation post came alive. A radio operator adjusted his headset, the soft crackle of static filling the bunker. Maps were spread across a folding table, corners held down with empty shell casings. The air smelled of damp concrete, machine oil, and stale tobacco. Lieutenant Ernst Weber, barely 24, approached with the morning situation report clutched to his chest. "Herr General," he said quietly, "reconnaissance patrols report no Allied movement within 10 kilometers. Forward observers confirm no artillery flashes overnight. All units report readiness." Von Richter did not lower his binoculars. Below them, 12,000 men prepared for a day they believed would be like any other. In less than 6 minutes, most of them would cease to exist. 0547 hours, June 18, 1944. The minute hand on von Richter's wristwatch clicked forward with mechanical indifference. Down in the valley, the fog began to thin. Pale morning light filtered through the mist, slowly revealing the true scale of the force assembled below. What had looked abstract from a distance now resolved into thousands of individual lives moving through routine motions, boots laced, rifles cleaned, engines coaxed awake with quiet curses and practiced hands. Field kitchens worked efficiently, their crews ladling thin coffee into tin cups. Men stood in loose circles, steam rising from their breath as much as from the cups themselves. Some laughed, others smoked. A few reed letters folded and refolded so many times the paper had grown soft. This was the rhythm of an army at rest. Officers moved between units, reviewing maps spread over crate tops. Orders were repeated, clarified, corrected. Somewhere, a harmonica played a slow, almost cheerful tune, thin and distant but unmistakably human. General von Richter observed it all through his binoculars, his expression unreadable. Experience had taught him that the most dangerous moments in war were not when bullets were flying, but when everything felt normal. Normal bred carelessness. Normal dulled the edge of survival. He had learned to distrust quiet. He glanced again at his watch. 05:47 and 30 seconds. Lieutenant Weber stood beside him, clipboard tucked under one arm, shifting his weight nervously. He was too young to have known the First World War. Too young to recognize the subtle signs of something being wrong without knowing why. "Her General," Weber said, lowering his voice. "Radio intercepts from last night showed no unusual Allied traffic. Air reconnaissance reports nothing new since yesterday afternoon. The men are asking when the counteroffensive will begin." Von Richter lowered his binoculars for the first time that morning. "The men always ask that," he replied. His voice was calm, controlled. "An army prefers movement to waiting." Weber hesitated. "With respect, sir, the Allies have been unusually quiet." Von Richter studied him for a moment. Unusually quiet. Yes, he had noticed that too. For days, Allied artillery harassing fire had dropped off sharply. No probing shells, no ranging shots. Even their air activity had shifted elsewhere, as if this sector no longer existed. In another context, it might have been reassuring. In war, silence often meant preparation. Von Richter turned back to the valley. He scanned the perimeter positions, the camouflage, the spacing between vehicles. It was textbook by old standards. Units dispersed just enough to avoid localized destruction, but close enough to maintain command and control. Old standards. The war had changed faster than the manuals. At exactly 05:47 and 45 seconds, the air changed. Not sound. Not movement. Pressure. Von Richter felt it first in his chest, a sudden, inexplicable heaviness, as though the atmosphere itself had thickened. The birds that had been calling from the tree line fell silent all at once. Weber noticed it too. He stopped shifting, his mouth half open as if about to speak. "Her General? Do you feel that?" Before Von Richter could answer, the radio operator behind them stiffened. "Sir," the operator said. One hand pressed to his headset. "Theirs." He stopped. The static vanished. For a fraction of a second, the world seemed unnaturally still. No wind, no birds, no distant engines. Even the fog appeared frozen in place. Then Von Richter heard it. Not an explosion. A whisper. A thin, rising sound at the edge of human hearing, like wind through wire, distant, multiplied thousands of times over. It grew rapidly, stacking upon itself, transforming from a hiss into a scream. Artillery. Not incoming fire, not yet. This was mass launch. Von Richter's blood went cold. He knew that sound. He had heard it once before, in the final year of the Great War, when British guns had fired in numbers previously thought impossible. But this was different. This was larger, faster, synchronized. He stepped back from the slit, shouting, "Down! Get down!" Weber didn't move fast enough. The scream from the sky intensified, converging into a single overwhelming roar. It was no longer directional. It came from everywhere at once, as if the sky itself had turned hostile. Von Richter grabbed Weber by the collar and dragged him toward the concrete wall just as the first dark shapes emerged from the thinning fog above the valley. Thousands of them, black specks, descending in perfect arcs. His trained mind did the calculation instantly. Shell weight, trajectory, density. This wasn't suppression fire. This was eradication. And it was already too late. The sky should not have been able to hold that much steel. Yet it did. From horizon to horizon, the dawn was sliced apart by thousands of artillery shells rising and falling in perfect mathematical arcs. They did not arrive in chaotic waves or staggered bursts. They came together, synchronized to the second, fired from batteries spread across miles of Allied lines. American long-range guns, British medium artillery. Canadian heavy batteries, one plan, one timetable, one target. The entire valley. Von Richter's first instinct was to count, not because it would save anyone, but because counting was what officers did when faced with the incomprehensible. His eyes tracked the descending shapes through the binoculars, his mind automatically categorizing them by velocity and angle. 155mm shells, 105s, heavy 7.2-inch guns. Too many. Far too many. The shells did not whistle individually. Their combined descent produced a single, continuous shriek, a sound so dense it crushed everything beneath it. It pressed against the eardrums, vibrated through bone, stole breath from lungs. Down in the valley, men looked up. Some froze, unable to process what they were seeing. Others dropped their cups, their rifles, their tools, instinct finally breaking through disbelief. A few ran, not toward cover, but away from the impossible geometry falling out of the sky. There was nowhere to go. Von Richter lowered the binoculars slowly. For the first time in his career, he did not issue an order, because there were no orders left that mattered. The shells fell in a pattern, not random, not scattered. A lattice of destruction mapped weeks in advance. Each gun had been assigned a firing solution calculated with new Allied artillery plotting tables and mechanical computers, devices that removed human hesitation from the equation. Wind speed, air density, barrel wear, temperature. Every variable corrected, every square meter accounted for. Von Richter understood it instantly. This was not artillery supporting an attack. This was the attack. The first impact struck the far end of the valley. A line of white-orange flashes ripped across the ground, perfectly spaced, each detonation feeding into the next. The earth seemed to tear itself open, throwing fountains of dirt, stone, metal, and bodies skyward. Then the second line hit. And the third. Overlapping shockwaves collided, amplifying one another, flattening tents before the sound even reached them. Tanks vanished inside expanding spheres of fire. Artillery pieces, iron machines built to withstand punishment, were torn apart like paper. The roar became total. It was no longer possible to distinguish individual explosions. The valley did not echo. It screamed. Von Richter felt the observation post tremble beneath his boots. Fine cracks spiderwebbed across the concrete walls as pressure waves slammed into the ridge. Dust shook loose from the ceiling, coating everything in a pale gray film. Lieutenant Weber had collapsed against the wall, hands clamped over his ears, mouth open in a silent cry. Blood trickled from beneath his fingers. The general did not look at him. He could not stop watching. The center of the valley disappeared first. Where command tents had stood moments earlier, there was now only fire and dust. Radio trucks were reduced to burning frames. Signal wires snapped, whipping uselessly through the air before vanishing under fresh detonations. Entire companies ceased to exist between one heartbeat and the next. Von Richter tried to follow a single unit, a motorized infantry column near a hedgerow. One moment they were there, men clustered around vehicles. The next, a shell landed directly among them. There was no aftermath. There were no survivors. Just a brief, violent flash, and nothing. The barrage tightened. Shells began walking inward from the edges of the valley, a closing net of fire designed to trap anything still moving. Even those who had instinctively fled now ran directly into fresh impacts, the ground erupting beneath their feet. This was not chaos. This was choreography. A conductor somewhere far behind Allied lines was counting seconds, watching clocks, listening to reports, while here 12,000 men were being converted into data points. Von Richter felt something inside him break. Not panic, not grief, certainty. The certainty that this war was no longer fought by soldiers alone. It was fought by systems, by logistics, by calculations, by factories and firing tables. The shells kept falling, and the valley kept vanishing. 05:48 hours and 23 seconds, June 18th, 1944. Time fractured. For General Klaus von Richter, the world narrowed to the ticking of his watch and the impossible sight unfolding below. In later years, he would struggle to explain it to interrogators, how the mind, faced with annihilation, does not speed up, but slows. Every detail stretched, sharpened, burned into memory with cruel clarity. At exactly 05:48:23, the final firing commands reached the Allied batteries. 3,000 shells were already in the air. They arrived together. In that single second, the valley stopped being terrain and became an event. The detonations did not roll or echo. They merged. Thousands of explosions collapsing into one sustained, universe-filling roar. The sound wave flattened itself across the land. A solid wall of pressure that crushed lungs, ruptured organs, and pulverized anything fragile enough to contain air. Von Richter felt it hit his body like a physical blow. The observation post shuddered violently. The concrete ridge groaned as if the earth itself were protesting the violence inflicted upon it. The viewing slit flashed white as overlapping fireballs bloomed across the valley floor. Below, the ground lifted. Not metaphorically, literally. Entire sections of earth rose several meters into the air, thrown upward by the combined force of the detonations. Tanks were picked up, flipped end over end, and smashed back into the soil like discarded toys. Armored hulls cracked open, their steel plates peeled apart by pressure no battlefield design had ever anticipated. Von Richter watched an artillery battery disappear. 6 guns. Dozens of men. Gone. Not destroyed, erased. The blast fronts collided with one another, creating zones of amplified pressure where nothing survived. Human bodies were reduced to fragments before the mind could register pain. Tents, vehicles, weapons, everything dissolved into flying debris, instantly consumed by fire and earth. The sky itself seemed to descend. A boiling cloud of dust, smoke, and pulverized matter surged upward, swallowing the valley in a choking, expanding dome. Sunlight vanished. Day turned to something darker than night. The shockwave reached the observation post less than a second later. Von Richter was thrown backward, his binoculars ripped from his hands. Lieutenant Weber slammed into the concrete wall, collapsing in a heap, blood streaming from his nose and ears. Loose equipment flew across the bunker, clanging and shattering. For a moment, just a moment, the general thought the ridge might collapse entirely. It did not. When he forced himself back to his feet and returned to the slit, the valley below was unrecognizable. There were no formations, no lines, no movement, only fire. The second stretched into eternity. Within that single second, 12,000 lives ended not with screams or heroism, but with physics. Pressure. Heat. Force applied so perfectly, so completely, that survival was mathematically impossible. Von Richter's military mind grasped the truth with horrifying clarity. This was not about breaking morale. This was not about forcing retreat. This was total destruction, executed with industrial efficiency. When the roar finally fragmented back into individual explosions, the barrage continued, but the decisive moment had already passed. Everything that could die had already done so. The valley had been emptied of life in the time it takes to draw a breath. Von Richter stood frozen, dust coating his uniform, ears ringing so violently he could hear nothing else. His hands clutched the edge of the concrete slit until his knuckles turned white. He did not shout. He did not weep. He simply stared. Because somewhere deep inside him, he understood that he was watching more than the destruction of his division. He was watching the death of an entire way of war. The noise did not fade. It collapsed. After 90 seconds of sustained bombardment, the roar disintegrated into fragments. A final scattering of distant booms, then nothing. Not even echoes. Just a sudden, unnatural quiet that felt louder than the explosions themselves. For a moment, General Klaus von Richter thought he had gone deaf. His ears rang violently, a high-pitched tone that swallowed every other sound. He opened his mouth to speak and heard nothing. Even his own breathing felt distant, as if it belonged to someone else. Dust drifted through the observation post like falling snow. The air was thick, gritty, and hot, carrying the bitter smell of explosives, burned metal, and scorched earth. Fine particles coated von Richter's uniform, settled into his hair, clung to his eyelashes. He stepped back to the viewing slit. The valley below was gone. Not damaged. Gone. Where fields and tents had existed minutes earlier, there was now a broken, lunar expanse of overlapping craters. The ground had been pulverized into uneven ridges and pits, each still venting smoke and flame. Fires burned everywhere. Vehicles smoldered. Ammunition cooked off in sharp secondary detonations. Fuel dumps sent columns of black smoke spiraling into the sky. Nothing moved. No wounded crawled. No survivors ran. No medics shouted. There was only smoke and fire and silence. Von Richter scanned the devastation slowly, methodically, as if conducting a final inspection. His eyes searched for anything familiar. A command post. A road. A recognizable landmark. He found none. The division had not been overrun. It had not retreated. It had been deleted. Behind him, something scraped against concrete. Lieutenant Weber struggled to sit upright, his movements clumsy and uncoordinated. Blood streaked his face from the ears, his eyes unfocused. "Her, General?" Weber said. His voice was barely audible, a thin rasp. Is it over?" Von Richter did not answer immediately. He was still looking through the slit, watching smoke rise where his army had stood. "Yes," he said finally. "It is over." Weber followed his gaze and froze. For several seconds he did not react. His mind, like so many others that morning, refused to accept what his eyes were showing him. Then his shoulders began to shake. Quietly at first. Then, violently, he turned away, pressing his face into his hands as he began to sob. Not loudly, not hysterically, but with the broken animal sound of someone who had just realized the world no longer made sense. Von Richter let him cry. The general himself felt nothing. No anger, no sorrow, no fear, only a vast, hollow understanding. This had not been a battle. Battles involved uncertainty, maneuver, chance. This had been a calculation. The Allies had not tried to defeat his division. They had decided it should no longer exist, and applied sufficient force to ensure that outcome. He glanced at his watch. 05:49 hours. Less than 2 minutes had passed since the first shell landed. Years of training. Months of preparation. 12,000 lives. Erased in 90 seconds. Von Richter turned away from the slit and walked to the radio table. The operator was slumped in his chair, dazed but conscious, one hand still resting on the receiver. "Get headquarters," Von Richter said calmly. The operator blinked, nodded, and began turning dials with shaking fingers. When the line crackled to life, Von Richter leaned forward. "This is General Von Richter," he said. His voice was flat, emotionless. "Report follows." There was a pause. Then a voice on the other end asked for a situation update. Von Richter looked once more at the valley through the slit. "There is no situation," he said. "The division no longer exists." He released the receiver and stepped back. Outside, the smoke continued to rise. A solid wall climbing into the sky, visible for miles. Allied spotter planes would soon arrive to photograph the results, to measure crater density, to confirm kill ratios. For them, it would be data. For Von Richter, it was the moment he understood that human courage no longer mattered. The battlefield had become a spreadsheet, and the numbers had just reached zero. In the weeks that followed, General Klaus von Richter would be interrogated by Allied intelligence officers. His testimony pieced together with maps, aerial photographs, and the precise firing records captured from the artillery batteries. What had seemed at the time like chaos revealed itself to be a work of mathematical perfection. The Allies had spent 2 weeks meticulously photographing the German positions in the valley. Every artillery piece, every supply vehicle, every tent and gun emplacement had been mapped from multiple angles by reconnaissance planes. Cameras had captured shadows, terrain elevation, and the orientation of vehicles down to the centimeter. Nothing had been left to chance. The artillery attack itself had been calculated using the latest American fire control computers, mechanical devices that could process hundreds of variables in seconds. They accounted for wind speed, barometric pressure, temperature, barrel wear, and even the Coriolis effect, the subtle influence of the Earth's rotation on a projectile's trajectory. Von Richter's mind, trained for decades to anticipate enemy movements, recognized the cold brilliance of it. This was not the work of generals in the field. It was the work of engineers and mathematicians executing a plan with the efficiency of a factory assembly line. The operation had involved 150 artillery pieces, spread across 3 coordinated batteries, each firing 20 shells in rapid succession. Timing was everything. The launch sequence had been synchronized to the exact second, confirmed via radio signals and forward observation posts. The first salvo created overlapping zones of destruction. The second fired before the echoes of the first had fully dissipated. By the time the third and fourth salvos landed, the valley was fully engulfed. The kill zone had been defined like a geometric puzzle, every square meter mapped and assigned a fatal value. Von Richter would later study the maps that plotted the blast radii. Each shell's impact had been predicted to the meter. Each detonation designed to either destroy a vehicle, neutralize a gun, or eliminate clustered personnel. Casualty ratios had been estimated in advance. Calculations had included secondary explosions from fuel stores, ammunition caches, and even the collapse of reinforced tents. He remembered one officer showing him the firing logs. Times, coordinates, velocities, angles, everything recorded in neat columns, as if the annihilation of 12,000 men were a laboratory experiment. The attack had been rehearsed on paper for months before a single shell had been fired. The technology behind it was new. Forward observers had tracked positions for days, relaying coordinates to command computers. Batteries that once fired independently now acted as a single organism, each gun synchronized like a limb in a mechanical body. The Allied generals had not needed to see the battlefield. They had only needed to calculate it. Von Richter realized this was not just a display of firepower. It was proof that warfare had fundamentally changed. Human courage, training, and leadership could influence outcomes, but only within limits. When faced with a coordinated, mathematically optimized strike, nothing mattered. No soldier could outmaneuver physics. No officer could outthink a computer-assisted plan executed with ruthless precision. He learned all of this later, during debriefings. At the observation post that morning, he had seen only destruction, and he had understood only the scale. Now, he understood the mechanics. Reconnaissance, aerial photos taken daily, plotted onto maps and grids. Trajectory computation, mechanical computers calculating firing angles and corrections for every gun in real time. Synchronization, batteries firing simultaneously to create overlapping blast zones. Meteorology, wind, temperature, humidity, and pressure fed into calculations to ensure shell placement. Logistics, ammunition stockpiled for months, ready for a single moment. Redundancy, observers confirmed coordinates. Backup guns ready in case of failure. It had taken decades for humanity to learn how to kill with numbers, and here it was, applied with horrifying efficiency. Von Richter often reflected on that morning, not on the loss of life, though it haunted him, but on the precision. He had seen thousands of men die, but they had not been casualties of combat in the traditional sense. They had been variables in a lethal equation, eliminated because the algorithm demanded it. In that moment, the general recognized a stark truth. The age of the soldier was ending. Infantry tactics, defensive lines, and battlefield cunning were no longer decisive. Artillery, calculations, and coordination ruled. The calculator had replaced courage. Later, when he walked through the cratered valley with Allied engineers and intelligence officers, von Richter saw the proof. Tanks crushed in perfect arcs. Trenches collapsed exactly to pre-computed depths. Craters spaced precisely to consume all life and equipment within a defined area. Even the trees that had once lined the valley had fallen in lines dictated by explosive force, not wind or randomness. It was clinical, it was efficient, and it was utterly terrifying. Von Richter wrote in his post-war memoirs, "I had spent my life learning how to fight. Every maneuver, every flank, every counterattack, all training, all doctrine, reduced to irrelevance by the mathematics of destruction. I understood in that moment that warfare had left the human mind behind. Men no longer decided battles, machines, calculations, and meticulous coordination did. For the first time, he understood fully that war was no longer a test of courage, but a proof of arithmetic. And that morning, in that valley, his division had been the variable that failed the equation. Years had passed since that morning in June 1944. The war was over. Europe was scarred, nations rebuilt, generals retired or gone. General Klaus von Richter, now gray-haired, hollow-eyed and gaunt with age, sat in a courtroom in Nuremberg. This time, he was not on trial. He was a witness, called to testify about the evolution of modern artillery, the industrialization of warfare, and the unprecedented methods used by Allied forces in the later stages of World War II. The courtroom was silent, vast, filled with the echo of footsteps and the occasional shuffle of papers. Allied prosecutors, soldiers turned legal officers, and surviving journalists filled the gallery. Von Richter's own uniform had been replaced by a civilian suit, but the posture remained unmistakably military. Shoulders squared, spine rigid, eyes sharp beneath a brow heavy with decades of memory. An American prosecutor approached the lectern. He looked down at his notes, then up at von Richter, whose presence alone seemed to command attention. "General von Richter," the prosecutor began, "we ask you to recount the events of June 18, 1944, in your own words. Please describe what you observed." Von Richter inhaled slowly, the words forming in his mind like careful artillery calculations, precise and deliberate. "I was in the observation post overlooking the valley," he said, voice low but steady. "It was morning. My division, the 352nd, was positioned below me. 12,000 men, tanks, artillery, supply vehicles. Everything was in place for the counter-offensive we had planned for months. From my vantage point, the valley appeared normal. Peaceful, almost a pause. His hands rested lightly on the lectern. I had fought in 2 wars. I knew the sounds of battle. I knew how chaos sounded, smelled, and felt. But nothing prepared me for what happened next." He described the first moments of the bombardment in the same way he had seen it decades earlier. The whistling arcs of thousands of shells, the sudden pressure in the air, the overlapping explosions that flattened the valley in seconds. The courtroom listened in silence as he recounted the destruction with clinical precision, not dramatization. They came with mathematics, not malice. Every shell, every coordinate, every impact had been calculated in advance. The valley was a grid, the men were points on that grid, and the artillery was a function applied to destroy them all. In less than 2 minutes, my division ceased to exist. The words sank into the room. No one moved. No one whispered. The weight of that industrial-scale death hung in the air. The prosecutor pressed on. "General, did you feel anger toward the enemy that morning?" Von Richter's eyes did not waver. He leaned forward slightly. voice dropping to almost a whisper. No, I did not feel anger. I felt obsolete. The word echoed. Obsolete. A man trained for decades, a veteran of countless battles, reduced in that single moment to irrelevance. His tactical genius, his leadership, his courage, nothing mattered. They did not die because they were outmaneuvered or outfought, he continued. They died because someone in an office 20 kilometers away pressed buttons in the correct sequence. That is not war as I knew it. That is industrial slaughter as precise and efficient as any factory production line. He spoke of the numbers: 3,000 shells, 150 artillery pieces, coordinated firing tables, meteorological calculations, even the rotation of the Earth. Each variable accounted for. Each death predicted. The men had been machines in a human equation, consumed by logic, not combat. Von Richter's testimony was not only about destruction. It was a warning. This was the future of warfare, he said, voice trembling slightly under the weight of memory. Human courage, human strategy, human initiative, they are not obsolete, but they are insufficient. War is no longer determined solely by men on the field. It is determined by those who calculate, who synchronize, who coordinate with precision beyond the ability of any single human mind to comprehend. That morning, I watched the age of the general die. The age of the calculator began. There was silence. The prosecutor, trained to react, to follow up, to dissect, found no words. Von Richter had not described a violation, nor had he dramatized a battle. He had described reality, a fundamental shift in the mechanics of war. Journalists would later write that the general's testimony was chilling, unsettling, and prophetic. Military historians would cite it as the moment the world understood that artillery, logistics, and mathematics had overtaken strategy and valor in determining victory and death. Von Richter finished, his voice steady, but soft. He lowered his gaze, imagining once more the cratered valley, the smoke rising in solid columns, the men who had vanished in an instant. He had outlived the war, survived interrogation, and witnessed humanity's attempt to reckon with its own industrialized killing. Yet in that courtroom, he understood, as he had in that observation post decades earlier, that nothing could erase the mathematical inevitability he had seen. When he stepped down from the stand, the silence lingered. People did not applaud. They did not murmur. They simply absorbed the fact that, in the modern age, war had changed forever, and that human bravery alone could no longer guarantee survival against calculated, industrialized force. Von Richter walked out of the courtroom, aged but clear-eyed, carrying a truth few could fully grasp, that in the valley that morning, the general's art had ended, and the era of the calculator had begun. And somewhere in the records, in maps, in firing tables and photographs, 12,000 lives remained, transformed into numbers, coordinates, and the cold certainty of mathematical precision.